Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about educating and organizing around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So let's look at the news this week. I think first thing we should probably talk about is Manchin's climate bill, which I call Build Back Badly. Brett Hartle of the Center for Biological Diversity, I think, summed it up best. He called it a climate suicide pact. And probably the worst part of the bill is that it would require the Interior Department to offer at least 2 million acres of public lands and 60 million acres of offshore waters for oil and gas leasing each year for a decade before permitting utility scale renewable energy projects for solar and wind. That's 600 million acres of offshore leasing. That's 4 times the size of the entire Gulf of Mexico. Of course, they're looking beyond that, looking to the seacoast off the east and west coast, up around Alaska. It's more area than the oil and gas industry even needs. So what the bill does is lock the government into permitting new oil and gas leases for the next decade. And anytime the Interior Department wants to do or permit a wind or solar project on federal lands, they have to first hold oil and gas lease sales first at that scale I talked about. And the International Energy Agency report last May, and that's not a radical institution, it's an intergovernmental agency that was set up after the energy crisis, 1973, 1974. They say we can't have new fossil fuel infrastructure projects, including drilling, if the world is to stay below 1.5 degree Celsius rise in global temperatures, which is the goal, the most optimistic, or it's still achievable, but it's very difficult. And of course, we're running out of time for that. So what this does is lock in current oil and gas production levels in the US for a decade. And they're calling that a climate bill. I call it Build Back Badly. So the question was, would Kirsten Sinema vote for it? And she used her leverage to get rid of one tax reform that would have tightened, not eliminated, the carried interest loophole, which enables hedge fund and private equity managers to take capital income and take their income from the services they provide and call it capital income, and therefore get it taxed at 15% instead of 37%. So big loophole for the very rich. She gets a lot of contributions from those private equity and hedge fund institutions. But they did replace it with 1% tax on stock buybacks, which will actually raise over $700 billion over the next 10 years, a lot more than the carried interest loophole tightening, which would have been about 15 billion, if I remember correctly. So I guess in the wash, that's actually better, although the carried interest loophole is just a thumb in the nose of, us regular people that pay taxes on our wages. So what happens now is the vote-a-rama starts tomorrow, which means they're going to vote to consider the legislation. The Democrats have it's a reconciliation bill, so they only need 51 votes. They've got the votes, 51 counting the vice president. And people are going to then offer amendments. That's the vote-a-rama. And Sanders has amendments against the fossil fuel provisions and for stronger health care provisions and Medicare negotiating on drug prices, which this bill has very limited, only 10 drugs by 2026 and not including insulin. And those will probably fail, and then he'll vote in favor. And so we're going to have this bill as our policy. And there have been a bunch, 4 that I know of, models done by Rhodium, Repeated, Princeton, Energy Innovation, and Moody's that have come to the conclusion that U.S. carbon emissions would be reduced by 30 to 40%, depending on the study and the range it gave, by 2030. I think all those models make unrealistic assumptions that are just too optimistic about the accompanying state and private actions that would go along with the federal bill. And we were on pace without doing nothing to reduce carbon emissions by 25%, just given the growth of solar and wind and movement toward electric vehicles and so forth. So it's not that big a difference. It's far short of what Biden, and I think he just pulled this out of his ass at Earth Day last year, said, we cut emissions by 50% by 2030. Of course, what industrialized, developed, rich countries like the US need to do is cut emissions down to zero by 2030 and also provide climate reparations or climate funding for global South countries, where a lot of these emissions are growing because that's where industry has moved. And it would actually be, we need to, with those contributions, reduce our emissions by something like 175%, according to the Fair Shares analysis that a bunch of environmental groups did. So, we're still just at the token level, even if the optimistic assumptions of these models come through. And then the other thing to remember is that there were 17 care economy programs, from tuition-free community college to child tax credit to paid family leave, that were in the original Build Back Better that are not in this bill. So, the care economy got gutted. And, I'm really sick of these progressive NGOs and academics calling defeats like this victories. We've got that from the progressive NGOs working on economic justice, and from mainstream climate people like Bill McKibben and Michael Mann and the Sunrise Movement and the Sierra Club and the Friends of the Earth and Evergreen Action, and of course the solar and industry trade groups. And I found a comment by Kate Aronoff in her article in the New Republic this week on this bill. And she said nonprofits, think tanks, and academics commenting on the proposal deal have millions of dollars in grants tied to being able to claim credit for something passing that can feasibly be called climate policy. So a lot of these, so-called climate movement nonprofits have been bought off. And I think we got to recognize that. So where does that leave us? I think our challenge going forward will be getting these fossil fuel provisions repealed and bringing back the fuller, well, really the Green New Deal provisions that, we've been demanding as Greens, as well as the care economy provisions, which is part of our Green New Deal, part of our economic Bill of Rights. So this really doesn't change much for us. And we have to recognize that we can't let this become the climate policy that sticks around for a decade, or it's a climate suicide pact, like Brett Hartle said from the Center for Biological Diversity. So another thing that I found worth noting this week was a study, a poll, a survey done by the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. And they surveyed American voters, and they found that only 41% of Americans feel safe at a polling place, given what's been going on. And that's only 28% of Black people. And the intimidation extends to all kinds of, political activity. 42% are afraid to attend a march or rally because they're afraid of violence or an attack on it by these vigilantes on the right. 35% don't want to put a window or yard sign up, fearing vandalism. 23% don't want to open the door to a canvasser. I mean, we've had instances, I think I mentioned this last week, where it's in my article in Counterpunch a couple weeks ago. An armed group funded by that pillow guy of Republicans were going around to Black and Latino voters in Colorado and some other states, basically accusing people of casting fraudulent ballots while they took pictures of their home with their phones. So no wonder people don't want to open the door to canvassers. Of course, we have what happened to the Greens, and maybe still is happening in North Carolina, where people were showing up to try to harass people to take their signature off the Green Party ballot access petition. They would phone, they would text, they would email, and then they'd show up at their home. and sometimes representing themselves as the Green Party or a Board of Elections official, which is fraud. And while the Board of Elections there is investigating the Green Party for fraud on some of their signatures, who should be investigated is the Democratic Party for this voter intimidation and representing themselves fraudulently. The study found that 19% don't even want to, they worry about going to a candidate forum. And, we've seen on TV how those can get out of hand. And 13% just fear going to vote, including 18% of both Black and Latino voters. And it's even worse for the young voters, Gen Z, 18 to 25. 23% are worried about going to vote. They fear going to vote. So, of course, we know why this is. We've had a lot white supremacist terrorism, both actual, violence and the threats are more ubiquitous. Mass shootings, election workers have been harassed and threatened with violence. And as I just described in Colorado, and it's happening elsewhere, voters. And the DOJ reports that 58% of the total of potential criminal threats to election workers and voters were in the states that had post-election lawsuits and recounts and audits initiated by the Trumpies in states like Arizona, Georgia, Colorado, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin. So we know where this is coming from. I mean, we're in a situation, if you look at those poll numbers, like it was when the Reconstruction governments in the South were violently overthrown by the Ku Klux Klan and other white vigilante groups, or other countries where, we read about this. They have elections and people are killed during the election and after the election. It's not where we want to go. And so what can we do about this? Well, there was election protection legislation in the Congress along with voting rights legislation. And of course, the Democrats couldn't get it done, even though they had the votes if they would get the filibuster lifted, which they could do by a 51-person vote with all the Democrats and Vice President Harris voting to change the rules to lift the filibuster for certain kinds of votes like voting rights, abortion rights, or just lift it altogether. And of course, they've been there almost, a year and a half, well over a year and a half, and they haven't done it. They're not going to do it before this next midterm election. So we've got these vigilantes running out there wild, and the Democrats not passing legislation that could deal with it. Instead, what are they doing? Instead of passing election reform, they're going after Green Party ballot lines. And it's not gun shooting violence, but it's certainly violence to the principle of an open multi-party democracy. So I think that's why in the Green Party we need to take the lead on these issues, voting rights and honest elections, but also the things that we're bringing up that the Democrats don't even talk about: fair ballot access, ranked choice voting for executive offices, and proportional representation through proportional ranked choice voting for legislative bodies. So today is Hiroshima Day, August 6th, the day that the US dropped that nuclear bomb on Hiroshima back in 1945. And, that's another reason why we need the Green Party. We got the nuclear arms race, saber rattling going on. And in the 2020 presidential election, this was not talked about except by our campaign, which didn't get much coverage by the media. So it's not been on most people's minds. And now it's an issue more than ever. Maybe it's on people's minds a little more because people are beginning to realize in Europe, with the Ukraine war going on and Russian leaders' nuclear saber rattling, embedding artillery at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant complex of 6 reactors, the largest nukes in Europe. People are beginning to realize the nuclear issue is something we have to attend to. And that Zaporizhia thing is dangerous. I mean, the Ukrainians have attacked those artillery units, trying to do it with drones and precision weapons so they don't hit any nuclear infrastructure. But yesterday it was reported that 2 power lines were cut and a fire started not in a reactor, but in another building, started by shelling. And of course, the Ukrainians and the Russians are blaming each other. In any case, it's a dangerous situation. And going back to the Euromissile crisis in the 1980s, that's what led to the nuclear freeze movement and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to, that substantially reduced nuclear arsenals on both sides. Now the nukes are just minutes away from each other in Europe, like they were in the 80s. The Russians may have, but certainly can have, nukes in Kaliningrad, which is a separate enclave next to Poland on the Baltic Sea. And if they fire a nuke from there, it can hit Berlin in 30 seconds, London in 90 seconds. And of course, US nuclear subs in the Baltic Sea can hit Moscow and St. Petersburg just as fast. And given the short time frames, the possibility of an accidental nuclear war, because misunderstanding what you see on the radar, or misunderstanding messaging, or any number of things could lead to an accidental, unintended, or unpremeditated nuclear response. We've had many close calls over the years, even while the nukes haven't been this close to each other since the 80s. So we're really lucky to still be here. So the Greens, need to raise the demand of nuclear disarmament initiatives like we did during the campaign. I think post-Ukraine war, and we can start making this demand now. We should be demanding that the U.S. government, instead of expanding NATO and versus Russia, work toward what Gorbachev suggested when the USSR broke apart. Let's have a common European home for all the countries, a post-NATO trans-European security framework that includes Russia. And once you have that framework, then you can negotiate mutual nuclear as well as conventional disarmament. We need to engage with China, take initiatives. And right now we're in a bad situation because after Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan this week, China said we're not talking to the U.S. about military or climate matters. The U.S. should just take the posture, well, we're ready to talk, and challenge them publicly, public diplomacy, to get back to the table, because these are matters, whatever differences we have to be resolved in the interest of both countries and really everybody in the world. It's the U.S. that unilaterally withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty under Bush, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that came out of the Gorbachev-Reagan agreements. That was done by Trump. He got out of the Open Skies Treaty. And then Biden, as soon as he came in, said, yeah, we don't want to get back into that. And then Trump got out of the Iran nuclear deal. And the Biden administration is, I'm not sure if they really want to do it. They keep putting conditions on Iran. Iran keeps putting conditions back. So that's something that should have been done early in the Biden administration and has not. So we're facing, nuclear proliferation with another country that's, been aggressive in its region, and with nukes, who knows what they would do. So there's a lot to do. Democrats are making this an issue. The Greens have got to. So before I open up to question and answer, let's note some good news. On Tuesday, the people of Kansas rejected a referendum for an abortion ban by a 59 to 41% margin, a landslide. And that's good news. Now we have to temper that with the fact that Indiana yesterday adopted, the legislature passed, and the governor immediately signed a near total abortion ban. So, this fight is far from over. But I think that referendum shows the difference between where the politicians are at and where the voters are at. I mean, the polling shows, and we're talking about conservative Kansas, but the polling shows in the United States, Americans are overwhelmingly progressive on social and economic issues. And the problem in this country is that public opinion doesn't translate into public policy because the politicians answer to their donors more than their voters. And we got a victory in Kansas because the referendum bypassed the bought and paid for politician. So that brings us back to a theme I keep talking about, is Greens got to take the lead on pro-democracy reforms to create an inclusive multi-party democracy. fair ballot access, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. When we have Greens in the legislatures, the whole dynamic is going to change because we'll give voice and power to the progressive majority on so many of these issues. And that will force the Democrats, just for their own political survival, to vote with us on reforms. It'll change the whole dynamic. And so these inclusive democracy reforms, I think, are key to advancing not just the green agenda, but saving our democracy in the United States. So I'll stop there and look for your questions and comments. Mr. Anderson, what is going on with Warrior Met Coal, NLRB, and United Mine Workers? Is the union for the mine workers going to have to pay Warrior Met Coal? Yeah, I didn't look into the details. I did see there was a court ruling. They, I guess, went out on a strike that was had an injunction against it. And when you do that under the Taft-Hartley amendments to the National Labor Relations Board, those amendments were made in 1947. It makes it hard for unions to strike, particularly if a company can get a court order. So the union, is it going to have to pay? I'm afraid they are going to have to stay, in good graces with the law. Otherwise, they may have assets seized, which would probably be worse than just paying. And I don't know, if they've got the resources for the fine. As I recall, it was a few $1 million. They probably have that. But, it's just terrible. That's why we need this PRO Act. That was another part of the Democratic agenda that got nowhere. It was part of Obama's agenda, earlier called Employee Free Choice Act, which provided for card check recognition of workers as a bargaining unit, a union. And then, Obama promised it in 2008, didn't do anything, promised it again in 2012. And I know the Teamsters, who then led by Jimmy Hoffa Jr., not my favorite union leader, but, he said, what's with the Free Choice Act? And Obama said, no, we're not going to do anything. In other words, they got the union support, or he got the union support, and then just told them to take a hike. So labor law reform, the Taft-Hartley amendments, a lot of them need to be repealed, particularly those affecting labor solidarity and the right to strike. And also permitting right to work states where you can have a union, you can be bargaining, but it's not a closed shop where everybody working at the unit have to be members of the union, which makes it very easy to undermine the union. So again, here's an issue that Greens got to take the lead because the Democrats don't. At best, they give it lip service. And really, they didn't much in 2020, and certainly not now in the midterms. I haven't heard it raised as an issue. I haven't seen any, even the progressives talk about they're going to push labor law reform. So you end up with situations like this where the mine workers had a real beef with Warrior Met Coal. They go out on strike and they get fined for doing it. When I was coming up, my grandpa used to tell me the better thing about the United States than Russia is you can go on strike, to fight for what you need. Well, not really in the United States. It's very limited in what we can do. So yeah, labor law reform is something else we've got to lift up. Christopher W. Hall, Howie, thanks for all your work on our behalf. Question, in my district, there are two choices for Congress, a centrist Democrat versus a Trumpist Republican. What would you do? Random write-in? Probably a write-in if it was very close and Republican was a real racist autocrat. I might cast a vote for the centrist Democrat just so to keep that racist out. But I think you got to look at the polls and see. I prefer to do not a random write-in, but I write in a community leader who would make a good member of Congress. In New York, they count those, and oftentimes Greens who've run in the past for offices will keep seeing their name pop up with a good number of votes in subsequent elections. That makes a statement that gets published in our newspapers, and makes a little statement. So use your vote as your voice. And I think you just got to look at your district race and, see what it looks like at election time. And, you might have to make a strategic vote, defensive vote. But if, you already, in most districts, who's going to win. Over 90% of the congressional districts, according to Cook Political Report, Fair Vote, 538, all the people that monitor this stuff, the districts are majority, substantially majority, one party or the other. They're effectively one-party districts. They are not competitive. You can vote and vote and vote, and you won't get a representative who represents you if you don't happen to be in the majority in that district. And that goes not just for Greens, it goes for Democrats who are a minority in a Republican district, or Republicans who are a minority in a Democratic district. So, it's a shame you've got that dilemma. We should have ranked choice voting, proportional ranked choice voting for Congress. There's a bill in Congress to do that called the Fair Representation Act. And it would require all members of the House to be elected by, and the Senate by ranked choice voting. And in those states with more than one member of Congress, it would be multi-member districts of, 2 in the smallest case, up to 3 or 5, with proportional ranked choice voting. So, in a 5-district race, if the Greens have a candidate who can get 20% of the vote between first choices and transferred votes as they go through the ranked choice voting, we would have a representative from that district. And then you wouldn't have the spoiler problem. You wouldn't have the gerrymandering problem that creates these uncompetitive districts. So it brings us back to inclusive democracy reforms, ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting for legislatures. We really got to push that. I just saw the proofs of it. Ralph Nader's Capitol Hill Citizen, which they're not putting online. They want you to subscribe to it. I got an article about that. I called AOC, or I emailed AOC's press secretary, Ilhan Omar's press secretary, and Jamie Raskin's press secretary, and asked them to comment on why there's only 7 progressives, no members of the squad, on board with this Fair Representation Act. And also why none of them are pushing a ranked choice national popular vote for president, given the fact that the Democrats have lost to the Republicans in the 21st century for president. Those Republicans were first elected. They were losers. Like Trump, they lost the popular vote. Bush lost the popular vote, but the Electoral College installed them in office. You would think the Democrats would make that an issue and, have a bill and mobilize support and make it a big issue. So the presidential election wasn't the laughing stock of the world. People don't get this Electoral College, and when they find out about it, I got more interviews with European media and Latin American media than I did with American media running for president. They always asked about the Electoral College, and they're just dumbfounded that we are, operating with this system that is, a 18th century relic of a time when elites, really didn't want popular elections. But no, the Democrats, instead of, pushing really hard for good electoral reforms, from voting rights to getting rid of the Electoral College, they go after the Green Party and try to keep us off the ballot. And then they say they're the defense against autocracy from the Republicans. Yeah, well, we know what their democracy is. It's autocracy as far as we're concerned. So I'm just saying it's a shame you have that choice in your district. So do the best you can, and good luck. Mr. Anderson, how do we deal with stopping these micronuclear reactors and letting people know nuclear power is not carbon free? Also, how can we stand with the union of workers that work in these nuclear power plants? Okay, to the first part, we just got to explain to people these reactors still produce waste. They've been tried. They're trying to build these, so-called, what's the other name they use for them? Modular, smaller nuclear reactors since the 1940s. And they're economically less efficient because you don't get the economies of scale. They're certainly not carbon free. The whole nuclear power cycle includes a lot of carbon emissions, from uranium mining and to the fact that nuclear power plants are backed up by diesel power in case the grid goes down, and reactors need electricity coming in from the grid to operate. So, all the old problems of nuclear power remain. I don't see the insurance companies stepping up saying, we won't insure the nukes we got, but we'll insure these smaller nuclear power plants. Nah. So, it's just a bad idea. And the money we spend on that ought to be spent on wind, solar, energy storage, making a smart grid to accommodate the distributed nature of solar and wind and these renewables. So that's the answer to the first one. And we got a real fight on our hands. I saw, for example, Lisa Featherstone, who writes for The Nation and the New Republic, and I'm forgetting which publication her article was in, but it was a pro-nuke article. There was an article in the Jacobin by some so-called eco-socialists telling us in New York, who've been fighting for public renewables, allowing the New York Power Authority to build renewable energy generation facilities, that we need to be pro-nuke and pro-carbon capture. The nuclear thing, what's his name? Bhaskar Sankara, who's now publisher or top editor of The Nation, started Jacobin. He's pro-nuke. These people they need to go back and listen to some of us who were in the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s. We had good reasons, and we were right. And then how do we stand with the union workers in these nuclear power plants? We got to have a serious just transition program that gives these workers their current wages and benefits for at least 5 years, pays their tuition and living expenses for up to 4 years of college or training to get into a new job, and provides a pension, a good pension with health care for those that are at retirement age who work in the nuclear industry. I've talked with staff from the Utility Workers of America. I debated them in a conference that was put on by Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is an international group. And in principle, they want a just transition. It's just they are very skeptical that the government, even if adopted the program, could actually implement it. They cited, for example, the trade adjustment benefits that came out of NAFTA. And I know a lot about those because the Syracuse metropolitan area had the highest per capita number of workers that were eligible. We had a lot of factories shut down, and right after NAFTA, one of them said the day NAFTA adopted, bye, we're going to Mexico. They just rubbed it in our face. And we lost a lot of jobs because the utility, now part of National Grid, which we call National Greed, but then it was Niagara Mohawk before National Greed bought them up. They laid off all kinds of workers under the pretext of NAFTA because they could now, because of the easing trade agreements, could import power from Hydro-Quebec and the Ontario Public Power Utility at lower cost. So they used that as an excuse to cut their staffs down to the bone. And that created problems maintaining power lines, particularly after storms. There was an ice storm not that long after. It took them 6 weeks to get the power up in northern New York, which gets very cold. It might as well be part of Canada. And I've talked to members of the staff of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBW, here in New York. And they prefer to negotiate and work for the municipal utilities, the public power systems. We have about 50 of them in New York State, than with National Grid. So we can win these workers over, but we got to have a strong, just transition program that does what I described. Another part of it should also provide communities that lose property taxes because power plants or factories that rely on that power shut down because of the transition to clean energy. Their property taxes should be compensated until they can get their economy more diversified and the property tax base up. So communities are made whole as well. And then there's a broader concept of basically repairing disadvantaged communities, the environmental justice communities that have been harmed disproportionately because of environmental racism by toxic waste often from power plants, the oil industry, the refining industry. So that's all part of a just transition. But for the workers, there's got to be a iron cast funded program so these workers are kept whole as they make the transition. And when those workers look at what they're making in the nuclear industry, over 100,000 a year for most of them, and what they can make in installing wind and solar, or even updating utility lines, it's more like 50 to 80,000. So they're looking at a big cut. So they're reluctant to do that until we provide a just transition, so they can find comparable work after the transition period. And the United Mine Workers we were talking about earlier for years was against even the concept of a just transition. They called it a fantasy. Trumka, who came out, Richard Trumka, the former, now late head of the AFL-CIO, what was his quote? He said, the just transition is, I forget the quote. I just used it the other day. But basically, he was saying it's a fantasy. Oh, and Cecil Roberts, head of the United Mine Workers, said, I have yet to see one. In other words, a just transition. So, we've got to provide, a legislative program as we push forward our public power and other, climate action programs. The just transition has got to either be part of the bill or a separate bill that's in place when these other bills pass. And we need to be talking with those unions along the way. There's a saying in the labor movement, if you're not at the table, you're for dinner. And that's their attitude. And unfortunately, the nonprofit groups I was talking about earlier, they sort of think of labor as an afterthought and maybe a problem. So they come up with their program, they go to legislatures, they get a bill written, and then they say, labor, support us. And labor's like, well, we weren't even in developing this. I mean, and oftentimes they have legitimate problems with what's offered, like the lack of a just transition program. So I think, we got to work with these workers, their staff, and it's going to be a difficult dialogue. I mean, my debate with those utility workers of America is like, they're saying, we don't believe it. And that's true for everything we're doing. Americans are very cynical about government doing anything, being able to do anything. And if they say they're going to do it, following through. So that's another whole problem. That's why we need green administrations that are honest and not about, lining up the next big campaign contribution, giving out a contract for a contribution. That's pay to play. It's illegal, but it's hard to prove that there was a quid pro quo. We've got a lot of problems here. We need, honest government from Greens up in there who can actually follow through and show some programs that actually work. And then, rebuild people's confidence in public programs instead of what we got now. Everybody's kind of everybody for themselves. It's dog eat dog. And when that's the way it is, we all lose. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of China firing missiles into Taiwanese and Japanese waters? It's provocative. It's unnecessary. I don't like it. I don't like Pelosi going there knowing that it might provoke this response. I mean, U.S. policy should be easing the tensions, opening the communications. And as far as Taiwan goes, saying, one country, two systems, the status quo is good. Let's leave it like that. And neither side should try to, push it off that. Because once we start debating whether Taiwan should be independent or taken over by the communist government of China, which is really a capitalist government, you're talking about war and between nuclear powers. Now, the U.S. is ambivalent officially on whether it would help the Taiwanese. We do give them arms to defend themselves, but we don't want to be in that situation. So I think both the U.S. and China need to back off, cool off, and start talking again about the military matters as well as the climate crisis. Wonder if the moderator got distracted. Well, I'm just commenting on some comments I see. ROGB, Robert Zienwinski, look up Forward Party, Humane Capitalist Party, more BS to displace the left. Yeah, I think the Forward Party at first may attract some people who are progressives, but once they look at the program, about the only thing they can really get behind is ranked choice voting. And even there, I think we're going to have a difference with them because Andrew Yang is pushing the top 4 or top 5 jungle primary, and then have a ranked choice voting among those who are in the top 4 or top 5. That is a party destroying process, because in the jungle primary, and this is, an open primary, anybody can, get on the ballot. Parties will not control their own nominations. We've had this problem with top 2 in California, where the party will nominate, endorse a candidate, and then another Green will say, I'm gonna run too, and they're on the ballot, and it splits the Green vote. It makes it harder for them to get past the top 2, which we rarely do in California. It really only happens when you're in a one-party district and a bunch of Republicans or a bunch of Democrats go for the seat and cut each other's votes down enough where the Green comes in second, or where there's no opposition except from a Green. But mostly, we run in the primaries, and then we're out of the general. So what we need parties to basically give people a place where they can come together and talk and think through what kind of policy platform they want to advocate. Without parties, voters are atomized, and the people that dominate the process are the people with money that send these 30-second messages, on social media as well as broadcast media. And that's not a debate, a discussion. It's unintelligent. It's emotional. It's trying to push people's buttons to be against somebody. A lot of it is that negative campaigning or advertising. So parties have a role. We need civic institutions so people become politically educated. They're not being educated by these ads. So that's where I have a problem with the Forward Party. On the other hand, I intend to work with them and have had some discussions with them here in New York about a fair ballot access bill, a bill for proportional, ranked choice voting for statewide offices. And I don't know if I can get them to this point, but hopefully for proportional ranked choice voting for the legislature. I think we can work with them and some other groups, maybe libertarians, for those things, as we, get hopefully progressive Democrats on board, and then get a real movement that forces more legislators to the point where we can get these things passed. And, people say, they're not going to do it because it's in their self-interest to keep us out. Yeah, but public input, power, pressure has a difference. And we've actually made more progress by lobbying for these things, for fair ballot access, than we have by litigation. And you could say the same thing for ranked choice voting. Richard Winger of Ballot Access News, who knows more about this over the past 5 decades and before than anybody in the country, he made that point in the workshop on strategies for ballot access at the annual national meeting of the Green Party, in which I participated as well. You can find that online, somewhere on the Green Party page. But that's Richard's assessment. I think he's right. So, yeah, the Democrats go after our ballot line when we actually submit a petition. And in New York and in Nevada and some other states, they passed legislation to make it harder for us, the Green Party. It's aimed at us. In other states, we've made progress. Since the 1970s, we've made progress. And I think we can continue to make progress, particularly in this democracy crisis climate. We can shame those Democrats into getting behind more than just honest elections and voting rights, and as important as they are, but to open up the political system to all points of view. Yeah, the link to the ballot access workshop is in the chat now. Scout Trooper 164, yo, Howie, what do you think of Pennsylvania and North Carolina achieving victory to get on the ballot? Or even the favorability of abortion in states like Mississippi and Louisiana? Well, to deal with the last part, if you're referring to public opinion polls, which I haven't seen, but I assume that's what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, we know most Americans are for access to abortion, certainly in the first trimester and in cases of the health of the mother or incest, rape, and that kind of thing. So I'm not surprised. It's just the problem is Mississippi and Louisiana are run by, political elites that answer to, in those states in particular, very conservative corporate interests who, the labor exploitation rates in those states are higher than other states or most other states. So they're just a right-wing capitalist fraction of the capitalist class down there. Now, Pennsylvania and North Carolina. North Carolina did get on the ballot. The Board of Election voted to put them on the ballot. The question is whether they can get their candidates on the ballot, because the deadline to do that was July 1st. And that 3-2 majority on the North Carolina Board of Election voted at the end of June not to put the Greens on the ballot. They had to, quote unquote, investigate. And they investigated for another month, and they said, okay, they got enough signatures. We'll put the Green Party on the ballot. Well, oops, sorry. Since the deadline was July 1st, we can't put your candidates on the ballot. Now, the Greens are in court to get that fixed, and hopefully they will. But the Democrats are going to court challenging the Board of Election ruling that the Greens got enough signatures. And this is led by the top of the Democratic Party. Mark Elias, the big election lawyer for the Democratic Party. Everybody who follows this knows him because he beat Trump over and over again on Trump's fraudulent election fraud lawsuits regarding the 2020 election. 46 of them got defeated every time. Elias is in some states trying to challenge the voting rights or voting suppression and election theft legislation. But he really seems to be not so much for democracy, just Democrats, because he's been trying to get Greens and independent progressives off the ballot for decades. I mean, the big thing was what he did to Ralph Nader in 2004. Frivolous lawsuits, I forget the number of law firms, like 90 law firms, 26 lawsuits. Most of them were frivolous. They should have been sanctioned for, what they proposed in court. And he led that as the counsel for John Kerry, who was the presidential candidate for the Democrats that year. And I got a warning from Richard Winger during the 2020 presidential campaign that Elias was quarterbacking the efforts to get us off the ballot, which they succeeded in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Montana. And we were challenged in other states as well. So what I'm saying is North Carolina's not out of the woods, neither is Pennsylvania. They submitted enough signatures, but if the Democrats have until, I think they had 5 business days, but they could have postmarked the challenge Friday. So, Monday or Tuesday, we'll know if they're being challenged. And so the Democrats do that. Even if they don't have a legitimate challenge, they do it to divert us from campaigning. And if we have to go to court, wasting resources on, lawsuits or defending ourselves, instead of being out there, talking to the voters about the issues that we want to, and the policies we want to advocate. So I think it's good that Pennsylvania and North Carolina got enough signatures. We got to be out there doing that. I haven't heard Massachusetts was due, I think, a couple of weeks ago. I haven't heard much about that. I wonder if they got on. Missouri, there's a candidate in Connecticut who have to petition to qualify for public campaign financing. Democrats and Republicans don't have to do that, but the Greens as a minor party do. Just another bias against us in the election system, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Mitten. How does the left survive if we have the so-called left, Democrats, who are worse than Nixon Republicans, taking the wind out of our sails, doing piecemeal programs? Well, I think we survive by making ourselves distinct from the Democrats. The big problem on the broader progressive left, and even the so-called socialist left, is that they're working inside the Democratic Party and they get lost in the sauce. Nobody knows they're there, or they've had a little more attention recently, but if they don't win their primaries, they line up behind the corporate Democrats. I mean, what kind of left opposition is that? So the left survives by being a left, being independent, being an opposition. And that's something that we've got to really persuade our friends who are progressives and socialists who are working inside the Democratic Party, that they are really reinforcing the capitalist Democratic Party that is more conservative than Nixon on domestic issues and even some foreign policy issues. I shouldn't say even, on foreign policy issues. And the only way they take the wind out of our sails is because we aren't putting our sails up with our own boat. We're getting in the same boat with the Democrats, who are, just totally corrupted by corporate money. I mean, they got super PACs out there supporting the worst Republican election deniers, COVID deniers, climate deniers in primaries, so they think they'll be easier to run against in the general. Clinton did that with Trump in 2016, and look how that ended up. And then we got the situation where, I don't want to pick on her too much, but Jessica Cisneros, for example, the progressive who is going to beat Henry Cuellar, definitely a better candidate, pushed strong by Justice Democrats and others. She has what they call red boxes, where she would tell super PACs what she wanted them to do without directly telling them. And this has become a common thing across the Democratic Party, but including the progressives. And it's just making a farce of the idea that independent expenditures are not coordinated with the candidates. Because the candidates are putting right on a campaign website, they say things like voters under 30 who are concerned about the climate want to hear when they're on the road, in other words, in radio advertising, that, our candidate stands for X. And that just tells the super PACs, okay, spend advertising on that without directly talking to them. So they're technically legal, but it totally contradicts the spirit of the law. That's your damn corrupt Democratic Party, even the progressives. So, if we're going to have a left, it's got to be a left. It's got to be itself. It can't get lost in the sauce of the corporate Democratic Party. Andrew Hager, if what Vox is saying is true, and there really is a chance for the polar ice caps to refreeze, what solution would you suggest we move for to increase such chances? Well, Vox, I'm assuming, is the Vox publication online. I haven't seen what you're referring to. Maybe what they're referring to is that, and this is going back to modeling done by people like James Hansen and Kevin Anderson in the UK, that if we do radically reduce carbon emissions, get to zero in the rich countries by early 2030s and the whole world by 2050, by the year 2100, we, along with mitigation efforts to draw carbon out of the atmosphere, such as reforestation and rehabilitating peats and wetlands and making the soil living again, so it will bring a lot of carbon into the living soil with those organisms which have been killed by chemicalized agriculture. If we do all those things, there's a chance of bringing the carbon in the atmosphere back below the tentative safety line of 350 parts per million that James Hansen proposed about 15 years ago. And we're about 420 parts per million now, so we're way above that. If we do all those things, then the climate will start it will peak at, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, but then start going back down. And then the polar ice caps would start refreezing like they did during the period, the pre-industrial period, before we started burning all these fossil fuels. So what solution would I suggest? The Green New Deal, a rapid transition to zero emissions, and then, climate mitigation efforts to draw carbon down. And then over the next century, we could, get back to a climate that is the one that humanity evolved within, particularly in the last 10,000 years when agriculture was such an important part of our livelihood, and which is absolutely necessary given the number of human beings on Earth now. Michael Shin, Howie, leftists tend to hate and ostracize the police. I think alienating and surrendering state enforcers to the right is counterproductive if we want systemic transformation. Your thoughts? Yes, I think you're right. I mean, if there's going to be fundamental change, revolutionary or radical change, we can expect the right to resist that violently. The example of Salvador Allende in Chile. He was elected, and the U.S. establishment, the Nixon Kissinger administration fostered a coup by the right. And, if you're going to have a revolution and you study revolutions, the armed forces go with the revolution, or the majority of them do. If they don't, and they really are committed to the establishment, they'll kill the revolution. They'll kill the revolutionaries. So you always want to fraternize with the armed forces. We did that during the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the GI movement. I mean, there are really three reasons why the Vietnam War ended. The important one was, of course, the Vietnamese resisted. The peace movement was pressuring our government, but the soldiers stopped fighting, particularly after the Tet Offensive. The army, just was refusing to fight in Vietnam. They said, it's not our fight. And we won them over to the peace movement. And I saw that in the Marine Corps, because at the tail end of that, I went in the Marine Corps to be part of that GI movement. It was already there. Now, when it comes to police in your community, first of all, you want to humanize the relationship, because if they are urged or want to do repression, it's harder to repress people they know. I remember Bobby Seale, Black Panther Party, when they were pushing for community control of the police, talking about how he had relationships with officers, particularly Black officers, but other officers as well, because he was tipped off a lot of times when the Oakland police, who were they recruited them from the Klan in Alabama, Mississippi, a lot of those guys. And he needed intelligence as to what might be coming toward the Panther Party. So there's no reason to aggravate the police any more than Pelosi needed to aggravate the Chinese, or the Chinese need to aggravate us with their military operations. So you want to build those relationships. And, when we talk about community control of the police, now there's another problem there, in that a lot of those cops are fascists, and they're there because they do want to crack our heads, and they do want to enforce, racial and class boundaries, and they shouldn't be in the police force. That's why we need community control of the police, so we can vet these people, and if they're bad apples, get them out, and there are a lot of bad apples. Now, of course, those cops will resent that program, but there are cops that really do want to be peace officers, do want to serve the public, and those are the ones we need to work with. And we also have to realize that it's not just the cops, it's the public. And, we're seeing this now with the rise in particularly gun violence and murders across the country, coming out of the COVID lockdown, and a lot of the trauma people have been through. people do want to think they want officers to defend them. Now, officers don't do that much, but that's what they want. So we've got to, keep that in mind and not alienate the general public like we don't care that they or their friends have been victimized by crime or are afraid of being victimized. As I talked about earlier, even, the vigilantes that on the right, we've got a lot of people concerned about participating in politics at all. So we have to recognize that, and Bobby Seale used to say this, the poster for the Community Control of the Police campaign in Berkeley, California in 1971 said pigs or police. And what they meant was, you want these people that are oppressing us and abusing us and brutalizing us, or do we want real police that serve and protect? I think that's more the attitude we need to take. And I find, frankly, that the people that, say the most about the police, and I saw this during the Black Lives Matter George Floyd protests, it was the white middle class kids that were provoking the police the most and, coming up with slogans. And then they would leave the community, and the Black community would have to deal with the consequences. So I think you gotta want to win them over, those you can, and then isolate those you can't. And that requires having a relationship with them, not just demonizing them is all bad. Whoa, the hour's gone. Well, coming up week, we got Nagasaki Day on Tuesday. If you didn't go to events today, or we're doing Hiroshima tomorrow, I hope you will, and talk to the people at those events about how important it is. And they're there for that reason, but it's a way to make contacts with people that want to, raise the profile of the nuclear weapons question. It's also a good time to bring up the nuclear power question that is coming back. And the fuel cycles are linked. And as we know, when there was a commission under Truman called the Paley Commission, and they were worried that oil was going to run out and we needed another source of energy. So the Paley Commission was supposed to study that. It reported back when Eisenhower came in. And what it reported back is we should go solar. And Eisenhower rejected that and said, no, we're going nuclear, the so-called peaceful atom. But that was really to make the nuclear weapons publicly more palatable and also institutionally build up the nuclear industry so it could produce both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. So I hope you'll go to those events this week. And if they're petitioning, the Greens are petitioning near you, get out there and help. And, this Build Back Badly bill from Manchin is probably going to pass. But, we still have a Green New Deal. We need to keep advocating that. We need to make sure that this bill doesn't become the climate policy going forward. We got to say it's not satisfactory. It's not up to the job. And we need an eco-socialist Green New Deal. So plenty of work to do. Hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next week.